it's hard to prepare slides or give any kind of advice if you don't know the audience. So here's the rough outline of what I'm going to show you today. I want to take a quick, brief look at what is IPFS, and then from there, I'm going to show also the different sort of interpretations of what IPFS is. I'm going to share some timeless lessons from the trenches, a lot of insights that I've gathered over the years, from other great engineers, but also some of the hard-learned lessons that I learned along the way. And then I want to just open it up for an Ask Me Anything. So what is IPFS? Sorry, I'm just getting a lot of echo. So what is IPFS? I think there's an ongoing discussion about this. And as the name suggests, a lot of people think that it is a file system in the sense that it's a way to store your files. And that is obviously to some degree true, but there's this common misconception that comes up again and again, which is, oh, I added my files to IPFS, why can't I get them? And it is true that you can add files, but adding files to IPFS, contrary to common belief, especially amongst newcomers, is not a thing that you do once and then it's magically stored on the network and is magically available on the network. The act of adding something to IPFS and making it available is an active process. I mean, it's pretty much like running a server. And so you can pay a pinning service to do this for you. But ultimately, IPFS is it's a way of moving data around more so than it is a way to store files. So it's not a storage system as much as it is a content routing protocol or a way to move around bytes. And so there's a lot of debates, about the definition, if it's a file system or is it just content addressing. But I think there's two core concepts that are really key to understanding IPFS and hopefully clarifying some of the misconceptions. And those are content addressing. And I think you may have heard this soundbite that content addressing is a way of storing things and finding things based on what they are rather than where they are. And the best analogy that I could come up for is the IKEA article numbers. So in IPFS, we have SIDs. IKEA, you have article numbers, like you have here 604, 169, 25 for this little stool. And it's very similar to a SID in the sense that it doesn't matter which country you go to, which specific branch of IKEA you go to, you have that article number, you're going to be able to get that stool. And so it works the same way with IPFS and SIDs, It doesn't matter where you're getting the data from, as long as it's available in stock somewhere, you can fetch it. And then the second aspect is peer-to-peer. So you have this peer-to-peer network, and again, you have this communication that isn't client-server. Any member of the network can be productive, so to say, which really leads me to this other meme and idea that we have in this ecosystem of breaking away from the client-server model with IPFS and moving into this distributed. And the best analogy that I could come up for there is this transition that we went through in the last 10 years from, analogies in hotel chains, we used to be tourists, and when we went to a new city, we'd have to find a hostel or a hotel. And there was a clear division of the roles. You had hotels and you had tourists, or you had hostels and you had tourists. And, as we transition into a world in which we have Airbnb, then, you have one account on Airbnb. You can be a host or you can be a guest. It depends on whether you're traveling, right? So essentially any member of Airbnb can be productive in the sense that they can become hosts. And in IPFS, we have the similar idea, right? By running an IPFS node, you can actually make files available. You can become a productive member of the network. So, I don't know, I hope you can see some of the parallels there. This kind of leads me to this idea of, the cathedral and the bazaar. Cathedral and a Bazaar is actually a name of a book that was written by Eric Raymond. He was a long-time Unix and Linux engineer. He's one of these old OG developers. And he wrote this book to describe how Linux became, the most popular operating system, for servers and for even mobile devices. And he describes some of the philosophy behind, how Linux rose to fame that it has. Do we have anyone here who's an Android user or a Linux user? Can you put your hand up? Yeah, so funny thing is, right, Android devices, they're actually using the Linux kernel. So really Linux today is everywhere. You know, it's running most of the internet infrastructure, but it's also made its way into the most popular, or the second most popular mobile platform, Android that is. And anyways, Eric Raymond describes a lot of different ideas about what made Linux successful. And in this book, he sort of lays out this quote in which he says, any tool should be useful in the expected way, but a truly great tool lends itself to uses you never expected. And I think we're seeing a similar thing in the IPFS world, where essentially, we had all of the ideas about what IPFS is, and we designed it with this kind of like cathedral in mind. When Juan started working on it, he had a very clear vision of what he wanted to do. And now, some years later, I'm sure that many of you were, if you attended the previous days of IPFS camp, you had the chance to see some of the really weird, quirky, interesting, cool use cases of IPFS. And I think we're just seeing this Cambrian explosion of use cases, which is also driving the Cambrian explosion in implementations of IPFS. So IPFS is making its way into, for example, the German manufacturing industry, as Rudiger spoke on my track yesterday. So we're seeing like all of these new use cases. We're seeing the metaverse, we're seeing internet infrastructure. Cloudflare is really betting on this, and it's sort of IPFS is making its way into use cases that we never imagined before. Now, that was sort of my introduction to what IPFS is. As I said, it's often confused to be a file system, but in reality, it's more of a way of moving data around, and really the interpretations of what it is are up for us to determine. So, if you have an idea and you build something and you're breaking all of the rules, so to say, of IPFS, that's a good thing. Don't doubt yourself, just go along with it. Do something weird and see if it works out in the world. And this sort of leads me to the second part, which is some of the timeless lessons that I learned from the trenches, so to say. And these are just a bunch of like random thoughts and ideas that I've collected. I get the sense that some of you are probably experienced in a bunch of different areas. I know some of you have a technical background, but these are just ideas that I've collected and have seemed to work out for me. So the first one is every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. And I think that, if you're trying to solve a problem that you have in your life or an itch that you have, you will see how the software that you create, you're much more committed to building it. And so I'm not going to get into a list of all the little tools that I've built over the years, but I'm also I can give an analogy that is outside the software world. I'm a hobbyist woodworker. And so I love building things that are useful for me. And, when you're working with software, it's a lot more abstract because it's all bits on a computer. But, in woodworking, you're essentially constantly, I love to constantly build things that, bring utility in my life. And so I think this is a really useful thing. And sort of when you bring your heart to problems that you care about, the software that you build is much better. Another one is focus on foundations in a world of growing complexity. The world of crypto is super, super complex, and it's really kind of hard to, go beyond just the marketing speak and the buzz and really understand, how some of these systems work. And a lot of these systems, if we just look at, say, Bitcoin, which has been around, say, 12, 13 years, Bitcoin is, pretty simple in the sense that it's not like as complex as some of the stuff that we have today. 12, 13 years later, we have much, much more complex systems. And if you're just trying to understand these systems, it's super, super hard because they're just building on top of so many layers of complexity. And so if you're really trying to get a good grasp of things, I think it's great to go down the stack and understand, things from first principles. And so some examples of this can be, the TCP/IP stack, having an understanding of how this model works. You don't have to become a protocol expert, but you have to understand how some of the abstractions were divided and what were some of the different responsibilities of, say, the TCP/IP stack. So that sort of leads me to the third one, which was embrace radical incrementalism. Release small, release often. So radical incrementalism is just this idea that you make very small iterations and you keep on pushing them out. A lot of us has, when we're building things, whether that's with IPFS, Web3, or just software in general, we're constantly experimenting. We have all sorts of assumptions that we're making about the world, and then, we're testing them out in the world. And the best way to get feedback and to create that feedback loop that improves whatever software you're building is by releasing small releases and releasing them often. Think carefully about how you measure success. I had this earlier in my career. I had this kind of like vision of, probably getting some VC funding, investment, and then maybe, building a unicorn. I sort of glorified this idea of building a big company that would be successful. And I think that it was very naive of me. I didn't realize what's the life of a founder of a company. And I didn't realize the kinds of pressures that, are placed on you when you go down that path of like founding a company. And if you look at, like a lot of the, VC funded companies, they measure their success in terms of user count. So, it's all about scaling, hyperscaling, and, does this scale? Does this idea scale? Can you bring this to, 1 billion users? And while that's a worthy cause, if you're building that kind of company, it's not the only kind of company that you can build. So you can build companies, software, and products that, cater to a smaller community of people. But those users of that product that you're building might be delighted. So really, it's good to carefully think about what it means and how you measure success with whatever software or tool you're building. These days, when I'm building things, I care a lot more about, does this project enable some kind of creative freedom for me and for the users? Does it delight users? So user count isn't the only thing. Do you want 1 million users, or do you want 1 million users who find it okay, or 150 who love what you do and are part of this tight community? And I think also we're seeing this kind of tension, with centralized systems and decentralized systems. Decentralized systems, they don't always necessarily try to sort of encapsulate the whole world or to capture the full population. You're seeing a lot more like local first software and software that is targeted at communities. And this is another quote from the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is, good programmers know what to write, great ones know what to rewrite and reuse. The great thing about open source is you've got so many tools today that you can build on top of. And so instead of reinventing the wheel every time, you can probably find a solution for the problem that has already been solved for you. It's hard to not mention open source. It was sort of a common thread throughout this, but embrace open source and the power of community. There's this misconception around open source that you can't build a commercial company around open source because everything is free. And yet, if you look in this image, you will see some billion-dollar and multi-billion-dollar companies who've built their complete business around open source. So beyond sort of the tooling that you get and the utility of using open source, like also from my previous slide, it's hard to not bet on open source. And I mean, almost everything we do at PL is open source. And just because you're doing open source doesn't mean that you can't build a company around it. So there's a lot of utility, and there's some great examples here. HashiCorp, Red Hat, Docker, Pivotal, just to name a few. And of course, trust the process. I don't think there's any shortcuts. Success usually requires putting the work. Yeah, I think this one speaks for itself, but this actually comes, I think, from like baseball. It's like a baseball quote, but it's this idea that, if you're trying to learn something, if you're trying to build something, you can't do it overnight. you got to commit to doing it over time. And as you commit to the process, and instead of say trying to clock 15 hours a day programming or building something, try committing to working on it 2-3 hours a day, but every day for a month or 2 months or 3 months. I think you'll see that the results of committing to a process for a longer period of time, they really reward. And so just before we wrap up, I think that, a lot of what we're doing here and when you're trying to turn your ideas into reality, especially in like a Web3 space and with IPFS, it's really about that sweet spot between users, developers, and decentralization. And so this wouldn't be a talk without a Venn diagram, in my opinion. So anyways, this kind of leads me to the last part, and that's an Ask Me Anything. So if you have any questions, please let me know.